So here's the thing about preaching in a time of pandemic. It pays to be brief. This is especially true in a week when one of the assigned readings concerns the martyrdom of Stephen, who was stoned by an angry crowd after he delivered a very long sermon to the council of priests who had arrested him. Message received. Do not let your hearts be troubled. That's a tall order these days, isn't it? I'm sure it was for Jesus' disciples as well. A reading from John this morning forms part of the farewell discourse, a kind of final study guide Jesus gave his disciples of all the things he understand during their time with him. This specific reading immediately follows Jesus telling his disciples that there is a betrayer among them and that Peter would deny him 3 times. Do not let your hearts be troubled. I find so much compassion in that line, in the acknowledgement that there was plenty of suffering and worry that would discompose his disciples, and that soon they would experience the grief and fear of Jesus going away where they could not follow. Jesus validates their confusion and worry and reassures them that despite the many griefs of life, they can find rest and peace for their troubled hearts by abiding with Jesus. When his disciples, humorously stuck in their literal thinking, asked Jesus how they might get there to the many dwelling places Jesus was going to prepare for them, they might have been expecting Jesus to draw them a map, like second star to the right and straight on till morning. Instead, Jesus challenged their literal thinking and proclaimed that he himself is the way to God. Now, I want to unpack that part a little, because the Christianity of my adolescence insisted that these simple words form the essential construct of the entire faith. That Christianity insists, sometimes desperately, that Christ as the way is a destination, that once the Christian finds the way, they have found the dwelling places also, and therefore their hearts ought not be troubled. For how can one be troubled when one lives with God? Any trouble, therefore, is a sign of imperfect faith that must be rooted out, or, in the most extreme cases, is a sign that one had never really found the way in the first place. But is the way a destination exclusive only and justify and oppression, forced conversions, and cultural destruction? Must a Christian, in order not to have a troubled heart, look away from our shared history of oppression? Sorry about the sounds in the background. And turn away also from current examples of oppression. What does it really mean for Jesus to be the way to God? And what does it mean for us not to let our hearts be troubled? Hey, Sophia, can you keep it down a little? Thank you. I tell you what, parenting at a time of pandemic, it's great. It's that second question that pulls me up, but I suppose both questions are urgent for us right now, in the midst of this pandemic that has separated us into essential and non-essential, into high risk and low risk. This pandemic has separated most of us into our individual homes, where we stay isolated, unable to access the communities and activities that brought comfort into our lives before. This pandemic has revealed inequalities and dangerous assumptions that were always there, but which white America could, and did, easily ignore. On this Mother's Day, those of us who usually celebrate the day with our mothers or our children may grieve the temporary loss of our traditions, the brunches, dinners, and hugs we can't share. Those of us who find Mother's Day to be a day of mourning for the mothers we've lost or the children we could not have may grieve alone, unable to gather with others for comfort. We are beset by griefs, large and small, the obvious ones and the ones so petty we are ashamed to give them name. And yet Jesus is with us through it all. The way, rather than being a destination we achieve through unshakable faith and steadfast heart, is instead an invitation to travel with Jesus, to abide in relationship with him as we move each day and throughout our lives deeper into the heart of God, the heart of active love and fulfilling life. Right now, my heart is troubled. As I meditated on what it means to follow the way and to grapple with my troubled heart, I read a quote from Julian of Norwich that crystallized some of my confusion and gave me comfort. And I hope it gives you comfort also. If there is anywhere on earth a lover of God who was always kept safe, I know nothing of it, for it was not shown to me. But this was shown, that in falling and rising again, we are always kept in the same precious love. He did not say, "You shall not be tempest-tossed." He did not say, "You shall not be work-weary." He did not say, "You shall not have disease." He said, "You shall not be overcome." We have not been promised a life free from conflict and distress, but we have been assured that when we encounter such trials, griefs, and troubles, that we are not alone. That is the peace of God, the peace that passes all understanding, the assurance that God abides with us, in us, building us up like living stones into a spiritual house, so that we can proclaim God's mighty acts of mercy. Our times are in God's hand, and God is our strong rock, a tower of strength, our refuge who leads us and guides us. This peace, though, and this refuge are not passive. Jesus calls us to follow him as the way, and we would do well to remember what Jesus did with his time on earth and the consequences that followed. Indeed, in the example of Stephen, we see one who held tightly to God while challenging the moral of belief, who received the law as ordained by angels and yet did not keep it. And when he was struck down by the angry crowd, he prayed for God's mercy. He prayed for God's mercy on the crowd and found God's presence at his side. Our calling as followers of Jesus' way is not an easy one. Abiding in Jesus, we must act in love in all the ways we can. For many of us, that means staying at home, wearing masks when we go out, and caring more about our neighbor's welfare than about our split ends or our boredom or our loneliness. It means challenging oppression and doing the work within ourselves to root out injustice and inequality, especially when they favor us. The final verse of one of my favorite hymns goes, "The peace of God, it is no peace, but strife closed in the sod. Yet let us pray for but one thing, the marvelous peace of God." Thanks be to God.
Amen.